Welcome back to the weekend editions of Daily Dose of Hebrew. We're working through 1 Samuel 3 now and paying particular attention to the accent marks and patterns that we find there. Before we get too far, though, let's read and translate 1 Samuel 3:2 together. Vayehi bayom hahu, va'ele shochev bimkomo. Va'enav, and the koreh here we have is va'enaiv, hechulu chehot, lo yuchal lirot. The translation that we get here is this. Now it came about in those days that Eli was lying down in his place, and his eyes began to be dim. He was not able to see. The verse opens with a pretty standard temporal clause. Vayahi is the call imperfect 3ms of the root haya, hey, yod, hey, plus a vav consecutive here, and it came about. The phrase in those days is a prepositional phrase to complete the temporal clause, and it came about in those days. The vav here on Eli is best translated as that. It came about that Eli was one who lies down. And we have to supply the verb to be, the to be verb, so we get that Eli was one who lies down, or was lying down in his place. Shokev here is a call participle, masculine singular absolute, and functions as a substantive with a verbal thrust, maybe we could say. And by that, I mean that we don't necessarily want to think of Eli as the subject and lying down as the verb, although that is in effect what happens when we get to the smoothed out English. Rather, think of this as a nominal clause to highlight something about Eli. The syntax of this verse intends to tell us some information about Eli during the time when Samuel was a young boy. The information that we do get about Eli is that he was one who lies down in his place. So now I know in good English we would say Eli was lying down, but I always find it a little more rewarding to think Semitically when translating Hebrew and thinking through the syntax. In the second half of the verse, we pick up some information about Eli's eyes. The first word here actually has a ketiv koreh in the Hebrew Bible, but most computer software marks these off using brackets or some other designation. Here we have brackets. Remember that the ketiv is what was written, and the koreh is what was read, and it was placed in the margin of the Hebrew Bible. The word in brackets here is the koreh that you would expect to find in the margin of your Hebrew Bibles. It indicates a more standard vowel pattern for the suffix on the dual or plural of ayin. Instead of enav, we would expect a knife with the yod. The translation is his eyes, again in a nominal clause with the subject or the initiator, his eyes, up front, in order to tell us something about that subject. The predicate or the announcement comes with the verb in the nominal clause. And here, the verb is hechelu. The hifil perfect 3CP of the root halal, chet lamed lamed, which typically means to profane, but here is better translated as to begin. The meaning to begin with halal only occurs in the hifil, so we don't necessarily need to put any kind of causative nuance on the verbal stem here because it only occurs in the hifil. We simply get his eyes began. The next word, chehot, is an adjective meaning dim. Now, this clause is technically missing a complementary verb for good English. In English, we would expect to get something like his eyes began to grow dim. You get that to grow infinitive there. Or his eyes began to become dim. The verb begin in English often needs a complement to finish it. It's odd to just say in English, his eyes began, and leave it at that. We might think, began what? If you look to the preceding nominal clause about Eli, you remember that we had to supply the to be verb there. Eli was lying down in his place. Here we can also supply to be in order to finish the hifil idea. So here we have, and his eyes began to be dim, we could say. So that makes then the adjective chehot a predicate adjective. The final clause here is a verbal clause with the subject implicit in the verb. The subject now jumps back to Eli, and yuchal is a call imperfect 3ms of the root yod kaf lamed, and it means to be able. With the negation lo here, we get he was not able. The final infinitive here is a complementary infinitive, finishing the thought of the verb to be able. Like began, halal earlier, we typically need a finisher for the verb to be able. In English, we would say to be able to what? And so here we get the specifics that Eli was not able to see. And so the root of lir'ot is ra'ah, resh, aleph, hey. Now that we have some of those grammatical elements down, let's look at the accents together. The first accent that we want to pick out is the heaviest accent. And as with any verse, the heaviest accent, or the one with the most disjunctive character, is the sof pasuk here. We then can break the verse down into two smaller segments, the Siluk segment and the Athnach segment. After we get these two segments, we can translate each one separately, and don't let anything from one segment flow into the other. Remember, the accents can help us with making smaller and smaller segments and sections to translate. In the Athnach segment now, we will divide the verse even more. The first break that we can make is at the tifcha here. The tifcha is the near subordinate of the Athnach, and it usually occurs one or two words away from the Athnach. The far subordinate accent of the Athnach is the zakef katon here. We can now add our lines to indicate divisions in this segment of the verse. Here's the yellow one, and again, here's the green one. We have one more disjunctive accent to mention, and it's in the zakef segment. The pashta on vayehi sets off the verb from the prepositional phrase in those days. The pashta is quite a small disjunctive break here, but it still allows you to see how the sentence breaks syntactically at various phrases. We can now add our red line for the pashta phrase. The other accents that we have here are all conjunctive, meaning they are read with the word following them. They make the little packages, so to speak. Both conjunctive accents are munach here and here. So with all of the segments divided up now, we can translate each segment without letting words from one segment flow over into the other. Let's translate this again and look at how these segments work. And it came about in those days that Eli, and Eli stands alone here as the initiator or the subject of that nominal clause we discussed earlier. The disjunctive accent here does put some emphasis or importance on Eli, letting us know that the verse is telling us something about him. So we would say that Eli was lying down in his place. Let's now jump over to the Siluk segment. And with the Siluk segment, I'm going to clean up the text a little bit and go ahead and just substitute the Kare fully. Let's get there, and there it is. Good. Now you're going to see the similar pattern to our previous Athnach segment. And we have the Siluk at the end of the verse, followed by the Tifka, and then the Zakef Katon. And the final disjunctive accent we have here, like before, is the Pashta. Let's add our lines to break these smaller phrases of the Siluk segment. The remaining accents here, as before, are all conjunctive. So we have the munach here and then the merikah here. We can now translate each segment of the Siluk segment, and again, just breaking it down into smaller segments of translation. So in this one, we get, and his eyes. Notice again how the disjunctive pashta sets off the subject of the nominal clause to highlight its importance in the syntax. We might say, his eyes, and then pause for a split second, or give some kind of inflection to highlight the importance of the nominal clause. And his eyes, we may say, or something like that. They began, and remember we have to supply the verb to be. They began to be dim. He was not able. 2C. I hope that you can see how these accents can help with translation. We just break the segments down into smaller and smaller segments of translation. And we'll see some later that actually are exegetically important, maybe next week. I think 1 Samuel 3:3 is one of those. And so hopefully these can be beneficial to you. At the very least, I hope that they can be beneficial to, again, just simply break down clauses and phrases of the text so that you get smaller and smaller segments to translate. Let us know if you have any questions or comments as always, and until next time, shalom.